So last week we talked about shape theory and positive and negative space, mass and void, and talked about how architects versus sculptors create space. We sculpt space for our player to move around in and to experience the world. And in order to do that, our palette for how we paint those spaces are done with shapes. So in order to get started with how we do that, we're going to go ahead and talk about shape and talk about how the different elements of shape. And this gets a little geometrical in theory at first, but then we'll get into a little bit more of the practical. So shape is, at its basic, can be broken down into points, lines, planes, and volumes. And so these are like idealized components of space. None of these really have any, I guess, they're idealized because they're geometric ideals. They're real in concept, but not necessarily in the way that we perceive the world. But we use them to sort of help our minds form the order in which we can discuss these concepts. So let's start with points. So the most basic element of shape is called a point. The point is simply a location in space. It doesn't have any length, width, that sort of thing. It's a spot that we have called out as having importance compared to all the infinite points around it. It's a point of contrast. And so with this point defined, our own position as we move around and our movement is given meaning as we sort of compare our relativity of ourselves to this point. So imagine a rock lying in the middle of like a large field. So the field just kind of goes on forever, but there's a rock here in the middle. Now, as I said before, elements of shape, as we're talking about right now, are not necessarily real, but they're perceptual concepts. So although this rock that we're imagining actually has shape and volume of its own, if you look at it closely, from a perspective as a person sort of walking across the field, this rock sort of represents a location. It's representative of this point. And depending on our perspective, the point at the center of the field could be represented by anything, really. It could be a column, it could be a tower. Obviously, those things have volume of their own and length of their own and things like that. But as you're walking around this field, it sort of is a point. You're walking around on a two-dimensional surface, and the point is sort of there in the middle to give you reference. So, this could be anything. It could be a whole city in the field of a map. It could be any size, really, but at least from this perceptual concept, we're talking about essentially a point. So a point helps us understand our own placement, our identity in the field. Are we close to this rock that's in the middle of the field, or are we far away from it? So we have a identity associated with our relationship with this point. How quickly are we moving towards the point? So points. How we use these practically in layout are, for one thing, marking end and progressive points along a line, or showing the intersection of lines, showing the significance of that intersection. It could designate the focus point in a field, much like our sort of rock visualization that I was talking about, so a rock in the middle of a field. Or points can be used in concert with one another to articulate the plane or a volume of surfaces. And points can also be used to match or mark the corner points of a plane or volume. So that's points. Let's move on to lines. So a line is an element of shape defined by the boundaries of 2 points. So any 2 points create a perceptual link between them. And even if there is no line drawn between them, the fact that 2 points exist and they can be seen in relation to one another creates a perceptual image of a line. So a line not only inherits the abilities of a point, as we talked about, allowing it to sort of define a location and a relativeness to our location, but it also defines a direction and a distance. So imagine the rock and the field, as we talked about, but now with a second rock. So as I navigate around the field, as I walk around, I compare my position to not just one but both of the rocks. And as I move, I compare my movement direction to the alignment of the line that's defined between those boundary rocks. Am I moving parallel or perpendicular? Am I moving diagonally to it? So if I were to stand next to one of the rocks and move directly towards the other, I could judge my percentage distance from one to another. So judge my distance. So we imagine lots of points could exist along this line, that if this line is an extrusion or progression or projection of one point to the other. And if we were to place more rocks, finding more points along that line, it would strengthen our perception of that line's existence. So in layout, we create lines to join or link elements. So if we want to create a relationship between two elements, we can draw a line between them. We can define a line between them that shows that relationship in space. Lines often are used to support vertical elements as a framework to columns holding up the ceiling. Lines can be used to surround and group objects. So this could be a couple of golf balls on a green, and the green has a line around it defining the edges of that. So it creates a identity within sort of the line space. Lines can describe edges and contours. So essentially the contours of a shape, the silhouette of a shape, or a volume rather, or the outlines of a plane. Lines can also divide plane surfaces, so you can essentially have an identity within the surface of a plane of being on one side versus the other. Lines can also help to articulate planes and volumes. So not necessarily the outlines of them, but that along the surfaces of the plane or the volume, you're able to have lines that help to describe what that difficult shape is. So from lines, let's now talk about planes. So a plane is, at its simplest, bound by 2 points, and a third point that does not exist between those 2 points, essentially a triangle. And in addition to the characteristics that planes inherit from their components, i.e. Position, direction, distance, planes also define sidedness in three-dimensional space. So you can be on one side of a wall versus the other side. You can add more points to define the plane. Usually we understand sort of planes that we have in our lives. Generally we imagine planes as being rectangular, having 4 or more points, as opposed to this triangle. Planes are usually in our world are walls, floors, and ceilings. And we place special significance on sort of the passing through those planes, the portals like doorways, windows, and stairs. So planes, one very special thing about planes as opposed to points and lines, as we've seen now, is that planes have shape. Now, the geometric idea of a plane is a plane extending sort of all in directions, but we understand planes in our real-world space as being having definite edges to them. So that's one thing special about planes. Essentially, they can have a shape like this. Planes also define identifiable zones. Essentially, while you are inside of a plane or on a two-dimensional surface, you can be within the confines of this defined plane, or you can be outside of it. Planes can also be used in 3D space to enclose volume. So as you can see here, we have some walls and we have ceiling and a floor that defines a space between it. Planes can also be used to articulate volume. So as you can see in this case right here, a repeated use of these planes creates a sense of the overall volume between it that is a lot stronger than just a simply ceiling plane or overhead plane and a ground plane. So that's planes. Finally, volumes. And the volume at its most simple is defined by essentially 3 points that are not in a line, essentially defining a plane, and then a fourth point that does not exist on that plane, forming a essentially three-sided pyramid. So simplest form of a volume. So volumes, for one thing, have form as opposed to shape. Form is a three-dimensional concept. Volumes can be mass or void, as we talked about in our previous week's lecture. And then volumes have a concept of being inside or outside. So volumes can be, we experience the volumes in many ways in the real world as rooms, as a building. You can be inside and out of a building, a cave, a body of water. So volumes are the thing that we are eventually trying to sort of create a sense of as we create our layout design.